Good afternoon. I'm Adam Scher, Vice President for Collections and Exhibitions, and I welcome you to your reimagined Virginia Museum of History and Culture. I will hope that most, if not all of you, had an opportunity to come to our opening events last week. If not, I hope you'll take some time after today's talk to look around. We've made a few changes. It's really just been an incredible transformation, thanks to you, our members, and our other supporters. I think we've really succeeded in our goal to make this a much more welcoming experience and to tell a much broader and inclusive story of Virginia in our exhibits and our programs. So take a look around. Tour our new exhibits, have a bite in the cafe, buy something in the museum store, and give us your feedback. We're still shaking out the bugs in our programs and in this new beautiful space we have, but we're eager to hear from you about things that we can do better. So please. If you see a staff member, someone with a badge, or someone at the front desk, feel free to give a comment. We want to acknowledge, of course, the people who make this program possible, our former trustee, Ann Worrell, who endowed this lecture series in honor of our former president and CEO, Dr. Charles Bryan. And before I introduce Charlie, our speaker today, just to give you a few program notes to keep on your calendar. On May 24th at 5:30, we will have Alex Kershaw here to talk about his book, Against All Odds, The True Story of Ultimate Courage and Survival in World War II. Most of you are probably familiar with Alex. He's a New York Times best-selling author, it's a hot ticket. We have almost a full capacity, but I think that there's still some seats available for that lecture. So if you're interested, I encourage you to act soon to get a ticket for that. On May 26th at 6 p.m., we'll have our spring garden party at Virginia House. You'll be able to tour the grounds, enjoy some food and music and camaraderie with your fellow members and with the staff. And finally, on June 2nd, our next Bryan lecture will be at noon, where Nancy Shepard will join us for a discussion of her book, Lost Attractions, The Parks and Places That Built the Tidewater. But today we have a subject that's near and dear to Virginians, of course, George Washington Parke Custis, who was raised at Mount Vernon by George and Martha Washington. Young Wash would later mark the national landscape by building Arlington House on the Potomac. He was a poor student, but he emerged as an agricultural reformer and a sought-after Federalist orator. An author who knew the first 15 presidents, he wrote well-received theatrical works and produced paintings rich in historical detail. In inheriting much of the vast Custis fortune, he also became the enslaver of more than 200 people. The slow march towards their emancipation became a pivotal struggle of his life, particularly after his daughter's marriage to Robert E. Lee in 1831. Charles Clark's first full-length biography of Custis offers a 21st century reappraisal of a unique life that bridged the American Revolution and the Civil War. Charles Clark is a retired journalist and a native of Arlington, Virginia, where he continues to write the weekly Our Man in Arlington column for the Falls Church News Press. 2019, he retired as senior correspondent for Government Executive Media Group. He previously worked as an editor and writer for the Washington Post, Congressional Quarterly, the National Journal, and Time Life Books. He's the author of several books, including Arlington County Chronicles, Hidden History of Arlington County, Lost Arlington County, and most frequently, and the subject of today's talk, George Washington Parke Custis, A Rarefied Life in America's First Family. Please give a warm VMHC welcome to Charles Clark.
So I wanted to dedicate this talk to the late Sarah Bars, who was an important editor here on staff at the Virginia Historical Society. She wrote 3 excellent articles on Custis that I cite in the book. And in 2019, I contacted her father, who was the eminent National Park Service historian, Ed Bars, who lived near me in Arlington. And he confirmed to me that she had planned on doing a doctorate on Custis and would have been the first full-length work on him. So I just hope that she would approve of the journalistic effort that I made in the last few years. So Custis lived what I say is an impactful, unique life. He knew the first 15 presidents. He was a networker. And he attended every inauguration during his lifetime except for the very first. So his life, 1781 to 1857, can be seen as a bridge between the American Revolution and the Civil War. But he's less known today. His house Arlington House was taken over by Robert E. Lee and eventually the Union Army and became Arlington Cemetery. But Custis shows up in every major book on George Washington and Robert E. Lee. It's usually kind of a cameo appearance, maybe a little bit cardboard. And there had been no such volume on him, although there are several on his sister, Nellie Custis, who was also raised at Mount Vernon. But he built Arlington House in 1802 to 1818 on the banks of the Potomac, and Congress officially named it 2 pieces of legislation in 1955 and again in 72, Arlington House, the Robert E. Lee Memorial. And it closed in 2017 for renovations after they got a generous grant from David Rubenstein to bolster its presentation of slavery. And if you're up that way, I highly recommend that you look at it. It opened last summer. And Lee is still a big part of it, but he's downplayed a little bit. But the over-examined Lee, who lived at full-time at Arlington House for just a fraction of the years that Custis lived there, has also, as you all have noted, been subjected to a 21st century demotion. So this presented opportunities for this book that I worked on to come out when it did. So here are George Washington Parke Custis' parents. John Parke Custis, known as Jackie, also raised at Mount Vernon. He is the son of Martha Washington from her first marriage. And in the mid-70s, he marries Eleanor Calvert, who was descended from the Lord Baltimore line in suburban Maryland. And they were married at Mount Airy, which is in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. And this is where George Washington Parke Custis was born. He was the 4th, the only boy out of 4 in 1781. Now, this was during COVID, so this place was closed. I had to sneak onto the property and get that photo, but nobody really minded, I think. So, because Jackie dies when Custis is an infant, 6 months old, early November 1781, George Washington Parke Custis and his sister Nellie, the 2 youngest, are adopted by George and Martha Washington and raised at Mount Vernon. The 2 older girls stay with their mother. And so that meant that Custis was raised in a life of luxury, which is exemplified by several of the portraits done by notable painters of the day. This is a couple of samples. And this is the most famous one, it took about 7 years to actually complete, but it shows about an 8-year-old Washi, as he was called by his family, with his hand on a globe, and I like to interpret that as high hopes that George and Martha Washington had for him. He was doted on by Martha Washington, the young boy. George Washington was more partial to his sister Nellie. But this engraving was circulated around the young United States, which made Washi a sort of a household name when he was just 8 or 10 years old. Now, Washi struggled as a student. He had a succession of tutors. If you visit Mount Vernon today, you'll see that this is the North Garden House where none other than Washington's personal secretary, Tobias Lear, would tutor him, but he had some other famous ones. And let's see, I think I went too far. So he was sent to some very good schools, starting out in Philadelphia at the school that was the precursor of the University of Pennsylvania, and then he went to Princeton, or College of New Jersey it was called, and he was kicked out of there for complicated reasons. And then he was sent to St. John's College in Annapolis, where he had similar troubles focusing and he was more interested in women and social life. So I tried in this book, and I did a lot of the research right here in this building, to assemble the best version of this. This is a famous exchange of letters between George Washington and his step-grandson about his poor study habits, and also Washington would correspond with the headmasters of these schools, and he would correspond with other relatives. Woe is us, what can we do about Washi? So I just wanted to read the quote. From his infancy, I have discovered an almost unconquerable disposition to indolence in everything that did not tend to his amusements, and have exhorted him in the most parental and friendly manner often to devote his time to more useful pursuits. Let's see, I'm going backwards, pardon me. So Washington comes home a little bit in disgrace. Washington is what he would be called when he was a little older by Martha Washington, but for clarity, I may still refer to him as Washi. He was back at Mount Vernon and kind of biding his time. And George Washington, as the war with France threatened, 1798, the war that never actually came to be, George Washington wrote to Secretary of War, James McHenry, to secure a rank for his step-grandson. He tried to keep that a secret because I think Martha Washington would not approve of that, but Tobias Lear apparently spilled the beans. Then Washington later asked McHenry to raise the rank from cornet to lieutenant. But Washington writes, "It is not my desire to ask this as a favor. I never have nor never will solicit anything for myself or connections." But then Washington proceeds to write to his factor in Philadelphia, Clement Biddle, to purchase fancy uniforms and weaponry for the young Wash. So at age 20, Washi is an aristocrat. You know, the Parke and the Custis names for much of the 18th century were far more prominent than the Washington name before that changed. And he knew, Custis, that he would inherit a huge part of the estate. Martha Washington left when her death in 1802, Washington's death in 1799, and that included about 200 enslaved persons. So as an adult, the young Custis, I say he reached high. He recovered. He displayed enough vision to create Arlington House on a choice hill on the Virginia side of the new capital city. And he would never really become a great man, I say. He tried once for elective office, but I think he came in fourth in a local race in Alexandria County. And he had a few minor appointments besides the cornet in the Army. He was chair of the Alexandria Committee on Retrocession in the 1840s when they seceded from the district. And he was a justice of the peace in Alexandria County for many years. So I call him an eccentric aristocrat, but he was one who was acquainted with the prominent figures in the early 19th century America in an era when honor and reputation were paramount. So he created Arlington House. It was built with enslaved and paid labor. It took about 16 years, and it was designed by a British architect, George Hadfield, who had worked on the U.S. Capitol and who did a couple other buildings in the District of Columbia. It's done in the Greek Revival style. At first, Custis had planned to name it. It was in honor of the father of the country, the Pater Patri, George Washington. He wanted to call it Mount Washington, but he gave up on that pretty early. I think there were some other properties with that name. So he chose Arlington, which was the Custis family plantation on the eastern shore here. And when he moved in, he carried with him lots of relics from Mount Vernon that he had both inherited and also purchased at auctions. And they included silver and china, the bed on which Washington died, and books that had belonged to Martha Washington. Now, George Washington's books went to the nephew, Bushrod. And there was also fine art paintings. And of course, this is now being stored in cabins on the banks of the Potomac in all kinds of inclement weather, so you can imagine the risks that was being taken there. But as the family patriarch in making, Custis hosted elegant parties at Arlington House. He held friendly sheep shearing competitions with neighbors, among them John Mason, son of George Mason, on a nearby island that is today called Roosevelt Island. Custis would sell hundreds of acres to Alexandria County land tillers, and he would build an important grist mill here in Arlington, which I'll talk about later. So what was missing was the love of his life, and he married Molly Fitzhugh. She had grown up in Fredericksburg in a Chatham plantation, and then up in Old Town Alexandria on Orinoco Street. And the family property in Fairfax County called Ravensworth was also a part of her childhood. And she brought with her they were married in July of 1804, and I was able to obtain the marriage bond. I had to get 2 permissions for this, the Library of Virginia as well as the current Arlington County clerk. I thought that was funny. It was easy, but I had to go through the motions. Molly brought with her, I'll call her Molly because they're both named Mary. The daughter's Mary, the future Mary Custis Lee, and so I want to make it clear who I'm referring to. So Molly brought with her good relations with her cousin, William Meade, who became later the Bishop of Virginia, was active in the reform of the Episcopal Church, and he was also, with his cousin and others, active in the American Colonization Society. But Meade was always grateful to Arlington House because he had visited it as an undergraduate when he was at Princeton, and he was still studying law, and it was his visit to Arlington House where he saw various books that had belonged to George Washington and Martha Washington that he decided he wanted to become a clergyman. Now, the Custis couple had, Molly gave birth to 4 children, but only one survived. That would be Mary. Meanwhile, Custis embarks on a career of, some people have called him the first preservationist, but he was a monument builder or a monument improver. And in 1815, he took a steamship, or schooner now, I should say, with 2 Revolutionary War veterans down to Pope's Creek on the Potomac, which was the site of Wakefield Plantation in 1732, where George Washington was born. And they rolled out a stone with some help from the locals, and this was later called the first stone to commemorate Washington. Now, Custis, as an individual, where his first more famous relatives were handsome, soft-spoken, and duty-driven, Custis was short, beak-nosed, verbose, paunchy, and playful. In other words, approachable. His daughter, in her later introduction to his memoirs, wrote, Mr. Custis was of medium height and well-formed, his complexion fair and somewhat florid, his eyes light and expressive of great kindliness of nature, his voice full, rich, and melodious, his deportment graceful and winning, his courtesy to strangers extremely cordial, and his affection for his friends warm and abiding. Now, he possessed this mellifluous voice that, in an age before microphones, could enthrall hundreds in a room or a public square, often on George Washington's birthday. He endorsed for president, he liked military heroes such as Andrew Jackson and Zachary Taylor, but he was tiresome and he had critics among the Jeffersonians. But he weighed in as an essayist and orator on the top tier issues of the first half of the 19th century, which included domestic economic independence, farming innovation, collapse of his beloved Federalist Party, the advent of the steamship and the railroad, protection of the rights of Irish Catholic immigrants, and the first federal benefits for war veterans. He greeted, advised, and entertained countless influential guests at Arlington House. Now, when the U.S. declared war on England in 1812, he opposed that, as did the Federalists in general. But by the time 1814 rolled around, the British were attacking Washington. Custis declared himself ready to fight, and he participated in the Battle of Bladensburg, suburban Maryland, and he accepted no pay. His farm innovations were acknowledged nationally in the field, and today the U.S. Agriculture Department on its website has a little notation about Custis's contributions. He experimented with sheep breeding to boost the domestic industry to compete with the imported merino sheep. Now, Custis's inheritance included the two major plantations on the Pamunkey River. The one on the left is the White House, which has ties to the Custis family and to George Washington and Martha, where they were married there. And the Roman cock, it was called originally. It was later changed to Roman coke. And you got to keep in mind that the profits for Custis's businesses were derived from these two plantations down on the Pamunkey, less so at Arlington House, where much of the work was done just to grow food for the family and for the gardening. So there were about 60 enslaved persons at Arlington House, but about 130 or 140 between Roman coke and the White House. This is an example of a ledger that the caretaker would report to Custis on, and it would. It's difficult for modern people to handle it, interpret it, but the livestock would be on the same page as the enslaved human beings, and there would be progress reports on which of the enslaved were ill and what their ages were. But Custis was really not a talented business manager, and even his own daughter admitted that, and he's a lot of the correspondence can show him begging banks for loan forgiveness. A big turning point then in his life was when Lafayette made his famous grand tour of the young United States in 1824 and 1825. Lafayette had remembered Custis when he was just a three-year-old boy, and during that tour, there was a famous dinner at Arlington House, which I used to open the book. But Custis traveled with Lafayette, and they went to Mount Vernon and Fort McHenry and Yorktown, and they would debate slavery. And by this time, Custis was active in the American Colonization Society, whose mission was to recruit free blacks and have them deported to Africa, which the country became Liberia. And Lafayette was an abolitionist. So Custis would spend the day with Lafayette, and then he would come home at night and write notes. And he eventually turned these into 16 published essays. They were called Conversations of Lafayette. He talked about a lot of those big issues of the day. And that was really the beginning of his career as a journalist and a memoirist. And the editor who helped him get a lot of these published, William Seaton, was editor of the pro-Jefferson National Intelligencer, but he was also a more general publisher, and he later became the District of Columbia mayor. Biggest red letter date then in Custis's life in middle age would be the 1831 wedding of the Army officer Robert E. Lee and his daughter, his only daughter, Mary Custis Lee. Now, they had known each other since they were children and had probably played together. And Mary would recall having seen a teenage Lee during that visit from Lafayette, actually in uniform in Alexandria. And so they had their wedding in the parlor at Arlington House. Custis was initially reluctant to give his consent to the marriage because he didn't really want his daughter in a military life, but that's what happened, and they would be transferred around the country and didn't spend as much time at Arlington House as a normal marriage would have allowed. The other interesting thing is that Lee's boyhood home, as it is called in Alexandria, which, by the way, is on the market right now for $2 or $3 million. It's been in private hands. But it was not just Lee's boy. It was Lee's boyhood home because his father, Light Horse Harry Lee, who Custis also knew and wrote about, was renting it from William Fitzhugh, Custis's father-in-law. So Molly and George Washington Parke Custis were married in this house, but they don't really bother to put that on the plaques because it's overtaken as Lee's boyhood home. Now, another example of Custis's responsibility for curating George Washington's memory is that in 1836, he worked with President Andrew Jackson and some others to arrange for a burial and rehabilitation of the grave of Mary Ball Washington, the mother of George Washington. And her grave had fallen into disrepair down in Fredericksburg. So he packed up the tent that George Washington had used in Revolutionary War battles, which his enslaved valet Philip Lee was responsible for pitching, and they transported it down on the water to Fredericksburg, and 15,000 people gathered in what today is the historic district of Fredericksburg, right near Kenmore Mansion. The then owner of Kenmore Plantation, a man named Samuel Gordon, had paid for a much more substantive monument to Mary Ball Washington. So that's a picture of the way it looks if you go there today. And this is the famous battlefield tent. There are actually several components to it, but this is the one you can see in the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. But there's another component of it in Yorktown Battlefield. And it was stored for many years at the U.S. Patent Office. And George Washington Parke Custis wrote in letters about how he worried that even though he loved to set it up for military picnics and things on Washington's birthday, it was in danger of being damaged due to wear and tear. Locally, that is, if you're a Northern Virginian, as Custis had a high impact role in building the grist and sawmill that's on Columbia Pike in Arlington. And this is an engraving from the Civil War when the Union troops marched right by it, but it gives you a good idea of how large it was. And it was manned by enslaved persons. And it was burned down during the war, and it was later John Barcroft built a bigger mill on that same site. But Custis was also active in the building of the Alexandria Canal. He had to sell some of his land to the entrepreneurs for that. And a private real estate project called Jackson City, which President Andrew Jackson was persuaded to lay the cornerstone, but it was really kind of a luxury home development on the Potomac River next to what today is the 14th Street Bridge. But it pretty much failed in the 1830s and 1840s and became kind of a high crime area in the latter 19th century. Custis also, he takes a famous trip more on the monument building in 1845, got lots of coverage in newspapers all over the Northeast, where he went up to Bunker Hill and Lexington and Concord, and he's a little upset that he didn't think that Bunker Hill battlefield was being sufficiently preserved. In middle age, in the 30s, they were starting to plan the Washington Monument. And though he didn't have an official role in that, he corresponded with a lot of the people who were planning it. And he even offered his site at Arlington House as to be the Washington Monument. And it took 20 years. You all remember that the monument was begun, I think it's 1848 it's begun, and then construction halts during the Civil War, and it's only half built. But Custis has donated a stone with his name on it. It's somewhere up on like the 60th floor or something. You're not allowed to go in those places anymore today. But and then he also, in his 40s and 50s, became an active playwright, and he chose, of course, a lot of George Washington themes. That's what the Indian Prophecy is about. It's a story that in 1770, when Washington's physician, James Craig, thank you, and Washington went back to West Virginia to look at the sites from the French and Indian War, where Washington had made his name, and they encountered one of the Indians that they had met years earlier, and that Indian supposedly told them that he remembers a great white leader on horseback who seemed invulnerable to their weaponry, and that one day he would predict he would be the leader of a great nation. Of course, that's Washington. His other plays involved Pocahontas. He tried to write a play on 14th century Scotland, but it was kind of a flop. And he had hundreds of people in the audience, 2,300 at one production. They were produced in Boston, New York, at the brand new National Theater in Washington, D.C. in 1836, and down in Charleston. But I think the critics, some of the professional drama critics, were not as impressed. And he wrote one play under deadline in 9 hours. He also took to painting, and if you go to Arlington House today, you can see his studio with all, it's set up again with all the equipment. And even his daughter acknowledged that he really wasn't so skilled, but his paintings did deliver a lot of battlefield detail, uniforms, and weaponry that he was qualified to give, since he had talked to a lot of the participants. And so his paintings were displayed briefly on Capitol Hill and in City Hall, but some senators complained about how bad they were, so they got taken out, which humiliated him. Now Custis, he did, this is another example of his work. This is called his Equestrian Painting. Custis did have detractors. Besides the Jeffersonians, the anti-Federalists, some of them critics regarded him as a George Washington pretender. He was nicknamed the inevitable after-dinner speaker in later life. He seemed kind of stuck in the past in late middle age. He was one of the last in the 19th century to appear in knee breeches and ruffled shirts, and he sang Revolutionary War era songs well into the 1850s. So that's why I say that his life was kind of an amalgamation of mediocrity and national greatness. But as the head of the American Colonization Society wrote later, Custis read much, his memory was quick and retentive, and his knowledge of history and public affairs of the world was remarkably full and accurate. So this brings us to really the big issue in his life, whether he liked it or not, which was slavery. So his attitude was complex. So this is a printer's proof of the laissez-passer documents that an enslaved worker would need to have if he wanted to go off the property or was asked to send into Old Town Alexandria to purchase things, that he would have to get a signature of Custis, and Custis would throw in a little spending money, and he was apparently very willing to give such permission. But Custis also, he showed up at the annual meetings of the American Colonization Society, and he argued with a lot of sort of pseudoscientific arguments and data about how skin color determined which races were best suited for which climates, I should say. And he was, but you got to remember that the American Colonization Society was very mainstream. It was formed in 1816, and it had James Monroe and Bushrod Washington and Supreme Court Justice John Marshall were involved, as were the presidents of the major colleges at the time. And it was heavily attacked by the abolitionist editor William Lloyd Garrison, and he wrote, he attacked Custis by name, and Nellie Custis was so furious at Garrison's rhetoric, which she considered dangerous, that she wrote an angry letter about him, which I reproduce in the book. And of course, Frederick Douglass later denounced the American Colonization Society. In the end, about 16,000 American blacks did go back to Africa, and a couple of them were from Arlington House, and they wrote to Mrs. Lee, Custis Lee, to keep in touch with her and said they were doing well there. So I'm so pleased that in the modern era that I get to individualize the enslaved persons a little more than perhaps was done in decades past. So there are three major individuals and families that I want to highlight at Arlington House. Selina Gray and her husband, Thornton. She's best known. She was Mrs. Lee's chambermaid, and she rescued the Washington treasures at the start of the Civil War when the Union troops were arriving to occupy Arlington House. And she arranged for them to be stored at the U.S. Patent Office. Then you have the Parkes, Lawrence the father and James the son. This is a drawing of Lawrence Parkes, an enslaved man, done by Mary Lee, when she was probably a teenager. She used to draw a lot. And the son, James Parkes, is so interesting because he was born as an enslaved person in the early 1850s. And after the Civil War and emancipation, he stayed on as a worker for the U.S. Army at Arlington Cemetery. And he would live until 1929. And in 1928, the Evening Star published an interview that a local scholar had written interviewing him about. And that's where we get some of the information about what it was like to be an enslaved person and under Custis, and how Custis was not so cruel as maybe perhaps Robert E. Lee was. We can talk about that later. But the biggest story of the enslaved community, and you can see all this if you visit Arlington House, was the story of Maria Syphax. So it had long been oral tradition, but it's pretty much been verified through other means that Custis fathered a child with an enslaved woman at least once, maybe more, because there were lots of mixed-race children on the plantation eventually. But in 1803, Ariana Carter, who was the mother who came over from Mount Vernon, she gave birth to Maria Carter, who then would marry Charles Syphax. And the first clue that we have that Maria Syphax was Custis's daughter comes in 1821 when they are permitted to have their wedding in the parlor, which was unusual in the enslaved community, and Maria and her husband, Charles. And then in 1826, Custis manumits Maria and her children, but not Charles for mysterious reasons, and gives them 17 acres of land in Arlington House property. And that land would stay in the Syphax family, which is still very united and does a lot of genealogy, well into the 20th century. And finally, in the 1880s, when she was nearing the end of her life, Maria Syphax gave an interview to a Kansas reporter in which she said that George Washington Parke Custis had called her in one day and said that I am your father, and that she was very close, and that Mrs. Lee is your sister, and that they were, Mrs. Lee, Syphax said that Mrs. Lee and she were always very close. This is where Maria Syphax is buried with other family members in Suitland, Maryland. And if you go to Arlington House, you'll see that they do a family tree of the Custises and the Washingtons and the Lees, and they have a direct dotted line now between Maria Syphax and Martha Washington. She would be the great-granddaughter. So we'll see whether that takes. So in the 1850s, Custis is nearing his final days, and there's a grouping of deaths in the extended family. His sister Nellie dies, I guess it's 1852, and his sister Martha is 1854, and his wife Molly dies in 1853, which put Custis kind of at a loss and had to have live-in help from cousins, nieces to help him get along. And he finally succumbs to pneumonia in October of 1857. His funeral in the Arlington House front yard was attended by thousands. It got worldwide press coverage. There were military units in formation. It's interesting that Custis had been invited to attend what would be the 1858 opening of Mount Vernon as refurbished, rescued by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. But of course that was not to happen, although the ladies continued with their work. And then there was a big fight over Custis's will, and I reprint the will in the book because Robert E. Lee ends up as the executor, although legally it's Mrs. Lee who inherits Arlington House. And Custis says that all the enslaved persons should be freed within 5 years. And but at the same time, each of the 7 grandchildren need to inherit $10,000, which is a lot more money back then. So Lee is stuck with this kind of no-win situation where he's supposed to make the 2 plantations profitable enough to come up with that money for the grandchildren, and he's not inclined to free the slaves. The slaves themselves had been told, and they testified to this in court cases, that they had been promised their freedom instantaneously. So Lee delays, and so it's not until the middle of the Civil War, December of 1862, right after the Battle of Fredericksburg, that Lee frees the slaves. So after Custis dies, this is the final photo of him, which I'll come back to that, I think. This is his grave at Arlington House. That's his wife's there on the right. And you can see that oak tree is damaging those tombs, and we're hoping that the Army will do something about that. They're in charge of it rather than the Park Service. So Benson Lossing was an accomplished archivist and historian, journalist, sketch artist who had written widely on Mount Vernon and on Revolutionary War battlefields, and he did a whole profile feature in Harper's magazine on Arlington House in 1853 and became friendly with Custis. So for the next 4 years, they corresponded, and you can see towards the end of Custis's life that Lossing is writing him these kind of seduction, charming letters, trying to persuade him to put pen to paper, tell us what life was like growing up with George Washington. Hurry, don't write plays or paint because you don't have too long on this planet. He's in so many words, he's saying that. So after the death, Lossing teams up with Mary Lee, the daughter, and they edit and put together the book, and it's published in 1860. And it's about 600 pages. It's a fat compendium with lots of different elements to it. I've tried to read the whole thing, but I use it more for reference. And it has profiles and recollections and material such as his own version of the letters between George Washington and him when he was in college. But to give you an example of the kind of information that the public, it sold pretty well at first. The public wanted about George Washington as late as 1860 was Custis was asked which George Washington likeness is the most accurate. And he told this New York businessman, Trumbull for the figure, Stewart for the head, and Sharples the expression, and you have all you can have of the portraiture of Washington. So after Custis's life, let's see, I think I want to do this. He had a passenger steamer and a Civil War balloon named for him. There was a waltz and a polka written for him about Arlington House. So I talk about in the ending of the book, and I want to give credit to my colleague Matthew Penrod, who wrote a fine afterword for the book. He spent 28 years at Arlington House as a ranger. You ask, could Custis have imagined the forces that his life had unleashed? I mean, if he had lived to see his son-in-law leading Southern troops in the Civil War. It's no surprise that Custis would mimic his hero George Washington in freeing his enslaved people only after his own death. He also seemed to have presumed, self-servingly, that Lee, as his executor, would work miracles in paying for the emancipations by heightening profitability at the plantations. But his relative leniency towards the enslaved and his ill-fated enthusiasm for the American Colonization Society were likely overshadowed in his mind by where his heart lay. That being the central theme of his life, a patriot's perpetuation of the fame and memory of George Washington as a sun that never sets. To the end of his days, Custis preserved what I call a patriotic optimism, one that leaped from his orations and writings, but was perhaps out of step with the times during the days when a great national unpleasantness loomed. So here's what Custis told the Jamestown Society in one of his final speeches. If in the wildest days, the wildest that ever was born of woman, had been told that the United States of America, in the short period of some 80 years, would become one of the leading powers of the world and would be in a short time the mistress of the world, he would have pronounced the prophecy an idle dream. So that's my formal presentation. I did want to add a little coda. If any of you like to travel to the Pamunkey River, just an hour east of here, this is what you would see of what on the left was the White House. It's really a suburban subdivision now. This is somebody's backyard that this picture is taken from. And on the right is what Roman Coke became. It's really more of a former railroad track buried in the woods without much human life nearby. But I greatly enjoyed my visit to the St. Peter's Episcopal Church. A lot of active parishioners still there. They're not all talking about Custis, I must admit, but they were just being normal churchgoers when I was there. But you can see the Custises and Washingtons all attended this church at various times. And in the graveyard is the tomb, the grave of the rector who married George and Martha Washington, David Massam. So I recommend that to you all. So I'm ready to take any questions people have either by Zoom or in the audience, and I will repeat the questions if we hear from people by Zoom. So
We have microphones.
yes, 2 microphones there. Thank you.
Molly's last name. Can you say something about her family?
Yes, the Fitzhughs. Yeah.
Fitzhugh Lee, you said was her last name.
Well, that's the name of one of Robert E. Lee's sons. So it's very confusing. These interlocking Virginia families, and they all take each other's names. So William Fitzhugh was a wealthy planter, and he first built this Chatham plantation, which is right in downtown Fredericksburg. You can still visit that today. It's run by the National Park Service. And there was a big slave rebellion there in 1805. He was getting nervous so he moved up to Alexandria, where he took over the house. I think it had already been built, that I described as Lee's boyhood home. And then his family built Ravensworth, which was a big house out in Fairfax County, which today is off of Braddock Road, and they have a sign there. It burned down in the 1930s. But all the Custises and the Lees and the Randolphs would inhabit all of those properties at different times. And there's yet another property called Hope Park in Fairfax, and that's where David Stewart, who was a D.C. planter and wealthy planter, he married Washy's mother after she lost her first husband, and they went on to have a dozen or more children. And it's interesting that Washy was being raised at Mount Vernon while his stepfather and mother were continuing to raise an even bigger family. So,
you mentioned that Custis was a very calm and gentle slave owner, but that Robert E. Lee was not. You said you were going to
Yes.
comment on that, and I must have missed it.
No, you didn't miss it. It's an excellent question, and I was sort of saving it for the Q&A because, I want to be a Custis specialist. I'm not really a Robert E. Lee specialist, but I learned in this research that you really have to branch out, and I read numerous biographies of Lee, and I read a lot of letters from him too. But I do talk about this drama in the book, that Lee was accused of, he was of mixed minds on slavery. He couldn't join the colonization society because he was a military officer. He couldn't take public positions. But and he felt guilty. He thought that slavery degraded the white man as well as the blacks. And so the people who defend Lee also say that the reason he fought for the South had to do with his family ties and identification with his home state, less than the cause of slavery, but that's debatable. But in the book, I talk about this drama where there's a letter published, and it's written by the brother of Selina Gray, who I talked about, Wesley Norris. Her maiden name is Norris. And he was escaped from Arlington House with two others, and they were caught and rounded up. And this is all according to a letter that was published about 1860 or so. And they were brought into Alexandria and whipped. And supposedly Lee himself did the whipping, and he stripped the woman barebacked, and where she had wounds, and he rubbed salt in them. There's all this detail. And so that has, in more recent years, a lot of people have, and then if you read the traditional biographies of Lee, or Douglas Southall Freeman, or I read Emery Thomas and Michael Korda, this is where they sort of make fun of Custis as being sort of too timid and weak, and Lee was a manly man who could extract more labor from the enslaved. That's sort of the image in the past. That has changed in the more recent biography of Lee. The most recent biographer, Alan Guzelmo, accepts the truth of this claim that Lee would have whipped this poor enslaved woman. It's a little out of character for him because he was a commander. He had people that he would delegate such unpleasant tasks to, you would think. And there's also, when the abolitionism is a big controversy, you can imagine that there's propaganda on both sides, and you don't know for sure. It's the only evidence we have for this is the Norris letter. But I print the Norris letter in there, and my approach was to let the readers decide. Really, I don't consider myself enough of an expert to say exactly whether it's true. So, does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Any others? Yes, sir.
You analyze this with your comment about Washi was dismissed from the College of
Yes.
New Jersey for complicated reasons.
Yes.
And wonder if you'd elaborate on that.
Thank you for that question, too. So it's interesting that the recollections were published with the sample letters from Washi and George Washington, so it's very clear he's a bad student, but there's never any explanation about why he's kicked out. And there's clues, there's a lot of 4th of July parties, and there's a lot of kind of party boys, we would call them today, among his roommates. And it wasn't until the 20th century that the faculty minutes at Princeton were uncovered that showed that he was dismissed in a faculty senate vote for improper behavior or something. So that's as close as we get to an answer. But it's just interesting that, of course, the Recollections book has to be taken with a grain of salt. It's not going to, I doubt they would acknowledge that even if they knew it at the time. But I don't think maybe his daughter even knew that, So, my guess. Any others? Anybody on Zoom want to have questions?
I'll go ahead and ask one question.
Yes, sir.
Which is, he didn't live to see the Civil War, but in his writings and discussions, did he express sympathies towards Union or secession?
Excellent question, too. So he in the 1830s, there was this crisis about nullification, where a lot of the southern, especially South Carolina, were threatening to secede if the trade laws were enforced, and they also objected. They had a gag rule in the Congress where they would say no debating slavery. So Custis objected to all that, and he mocked the South a little bit in his writings to the American Colonization Society. He talked about the Southern people made a mistake in becoming so dependent on slavery. So I think it's pretty clear that he wanted, and as a Federalist and a George Washington admirer, that he would want the country to stay united. And I think he would have been very upset with Robert E. Lee for fighting for the South. But that's just my opinion. So. Any others? Yes, sir.
Contemporary or modern viewpoints about learning disabilities and so forth, and also my personal slight connection with kids in high school that were really quite bright. I wondered, as you described his behavior and then these later things that he got into, I wondered if you ever considered, or any of the published material ever discussed, whether or not maybe this guy was a bright kid, and maybe like Einstein, so to speak, as was famous to have been a failure as a student, but turned out to have a mind that worked in different ways than the average educational system wanted. So it makes me wonder a little more about this guy in these kinds of ways.
Well, I think that's a fascinating idea. You know, you could go back and examine his letters. Yeah, of course, he's very articulate in his letters. Even when he's buttering up George Washington for saying, "I'm so glad you're paying for my college, and I promise you next month I'll do much better than I did last month." You know, sort of, I'm paraphrasing there. But you're right that more of the evidence to me seems that he was a rich kid who knew he would inherit money, and that George Washington specifically warned about the temptations of drink and women for college kids. It was a common problem for the aristocrats. And so, but the idea that, I mean, he was really kind of a genius if he could interview Lafayette and produce these essays and write a play in 9 hours. So, I mean, you're right that it's possible that he had some kind of ADHD and that he grew out of it. Maybe that's something that you would probably know more about than I do, but good point.
Just in that same line of questioning, I mean, from what I've read, his father was kind of a party boy too.
You are correct.
And didn't really take George and his education too seriously. So I don't know if it was just Martha's spoiling, or because I mean, I sort of remember, I think it was Ron Chernow's book that sort of the pattern was repeated, Martha's spoiling.
You're right. Thank you for mentioning that. See, it's so John Parke Custis was a student in New York City at King's College, which became Columbia, and it was the same drill. Washington was writing to him. See, Washington, you remember, had no formal education, so he was desperate for these adopted sons, first John Parke Custis and then his son Washi, to outperform him, and it must have been so disappointing for him when all they wanted to do was party, so. So what do you think? Is that all right? Well, I enjoyed it very much, I appreciate you coming. Yeah.